It's a great privilege to be here this afternoon. For an Englishman to come to the United States to talk about an American subject is tough, but a great pleasure. Wilson's already alluded to the importance in philately or any subject of bringing parties together, and that's essentially what I played a small part in doing on this particularly controversial issue. I'd also like to mention one or two people in the audience, many of which we've already come across in the other introductions, but I'd like to ask Dr. Gene Hall from Rutgers University to stand, because he's played a very, very important part in this about which you'll hear a little bit more later on. Now, this subject is enormous. I've never known a subject more complicated, more controversial and more fascinating. So this afternoon I can only touch on some of the issues that are key to the case, and I'm going to try to express this in simple terms. I'm not trying to con anyone. I'm not wanting to get into the detail of any particular matter or subject. I'd also like to thank the Sundman brothers. Are you known as the Sundman brothers? Yes, you are. Okay. It's like the Williams brothers, the philatelic writers, for producing this splendid booklet. And it allows me not to have to talk about every aspect of the subject, because in here there's 4 articles that are for and against the Grinnells, and it's a very balanced work. I would only make one remark about it for those people who are judging the stamps, and that the illustrations come from a variety of different sources, so you shouldn't compare a Grinnell that's illustrated with a missionary, because that's unfair, because the photographic processes would have been different. So that's just indicative of what the stamps look like. Well, by way of introduction, I'm only going to say that the first stamps of Hawaii were issued in 1851 and comprised of 2, 5 and 13 cents values. They were printed in Honolulu. Of these, 198 copies are still believed to exist. In 1918, a further 71 copies discovered by George Grinnell were rejected by the Superior Court of the State of California as forgeries in November 1922. Since I've become involved in this matter just in 2001, philatelists always do in old dates and get confused. I've had countless conversations in person, on telephones across the Atlantic, that I would measure in hours, and emails and letters that I would measure in inches, if not a foot's worth by now. This has been a great privilege and pleasure to have been involved in philately's #1 debate. I'm delighted to have played a small part in bringing all of the parties together for the first time ever to debate this issue, and most of them are here in this room today, and I hope that those people who've never met but who've been, I won't say arguing, but debating amongst themselves, are going to meet and shake hands at the reception afterwards, because meeting people is so important on these occasions. The Grinnell stamps are amongst the most interesting and complicated and fascinating philatelic expertising challenge of all time. And in words of the advertisement promoting this lecture, romance, drama, suspense, fraud. There is a question mark after the fraud. Now, the only thing that matters in this issue is the truth. And in order to get to the truth, you have to be open-minded and approach the issues without prejudice. The British Library and the Royal Philatelic Society London and its expert committee have no vested interest in this outcome at all, nor have I. We are completely neutral in the debate that's been going on. Only the truth matters. Now, I do not talk for the Expert Committee of the Royal. I'm not a member of the Expert Committee, although I have attended one of their meetings when I took the Tapling collection stamps along for comparison with the Grinnells. Now, because of that, I'm free to speak. Had I been a member of the committee, I couldn't speak because we don't allow members of the committee to talk about the patients that they're seeing. I should say something about the status of the Expert Committee. It is the oldest in the world, having been formed in 1894, but it operates completely independently. In fact, is operated by a wholly owned subsidiary company, RPSL Limited, and that company has a board of directors. But the operation of expertising is not influenced in any way by either the council or any of its members or the board of directors of RPSL Limited. The experts are paramount in their decisions, and therefore they are completely independent. And that is, as I think all expertising organisations that are in the first category should certainly be. Now, in order to make sense in this lecture, we must get the terminology correct. When I say missionary or missionaries, I'm referring to the 198 copies that are believed to be genuine. And when I use the term Grinnell or Grinnells, I'm referring to the 71 copies found or discovered by George Grinnell in 1918. I would also repeat my remarks for the quality of the visual presentation you're going to see. Once again, the images came from a variety of different sources across a long period of time. Some were slides, some were digital images, so you shouldn't look at something and compare it with another, because that will be completely unfair. Now, I suspect most of you have been downstairs looking at the Grinnells and the splendid copies that are in the National Postal Museum's collection here. And I want to ask you for a little bit of audience participation. Will you tell me, please, looking at the stamp on the screen, whether this is a missionary or a Grinnell? Now, would you put your hands up, please, if you think it's a missionary? There's one. Just one. Would you like to put your hands up, please, if you think it's a Grinnell? I see one expertiser there and one well-known expert on Hawaii. Okay. Now, would you like to put your hands up if you don't know? Most people here are very wise. Now, the answer to this is that this stamp was lot 32 in the sale of the Honolulu Advertiser collection, auctioned in 1995 by Robert A. Siegel Auction Galleries, Inc. in New York, where it was described as Grinnell reproduction of a 13 cents and realised $1,500. It is not a Grinnell. And the man that looked at it sitting in the audience thought it was a Grinnell. You should have a photographic memory, Fred. Well, I say this not to embarrass Seagulls or Thurston Twigsmith, who I had the privilege of meeting in 1980, but to demonstrate to you just the fact that hardly anyone has ever seen a Grinnell. Let's ask you, who's seen a Grinnell before today? Put your hands up if you've seen one before today. Just the owning families and the gentleman at the back I don't recognise. I will later. So very, very few indeed. And yet so many people have given me definitive answers to the question, are these real missionaries or not? So there's a great deal of ignorance around, and that, of course, has fueled prejudice one way or the other. So we've established that some of the people that claim to know don't. That's what that's done. Sorry, that's very unfair, Fred. teasing you. Now, the standard of proof in expertising is another particularly difficult subject, because it cannot be like in a court of law necessarily. Sometimes you have to rely on circumstantial evidence or the balance of probabilities. So in looking at evidence, if you looked at evidence that would come up to absolute proof in court of law standards, you'd probably never arrive at any kind of answer whatever. So the expertiser's job, particularly in this case, is very, very tough indeed. The possible outcomes of this are going to be that the expert committee decides that they are genuine, they are forgery, genuine of unknown status, or no opinion, we don't know. And it could be any of those. During the course of the last 2 years, I've kept all of that correspondence and copies of emails, and I now have a pile about like this sitting in the office, which in due course will be available to researchers at the British Library's discretion. Clearly some of it's a little bit confidential at the moment. The expert committee has already had access to anything that it wants to see. I'd also like, despite whatever the outcome might be, to actually salute the owners of the stamps for determinedly keep going with proving what they have and trying to get to the truth, whatever that is. There's been enormous prejudice across all of the time since 1918 with people not having open minds, and it works on several bases. They really ought to prove what that is, and we're here to help them do that. And quite frankly, if you owned the Grinnells, wouldn't you want them to be genuine missionaries? I mean, who wouldn't? Put your hands up. It's unanimous. So I salute them for continuing to keep going under what has been quite an onslaught at times, but I'll come to that a little later on. Now, my involvement in this, I should explain. Probably in the 1970s I undertook a program of philatelic reading, and one of the books that I read was the Maya Harris book, Hawaii and its Stamps and Postal History, published in 1948. And of course that informs my opinion as to what the Grinnells were, which essentially was that they were forgeries. My predecessor at the British Library, Bob Scully West, was very fortunate in going on holiday to California, where he met a friend of his, and the subject of philately naturally came up. And when philately came up, it became apparent that the friend had a friend who was called Pat Calhoun, and it wasn't long before the two met. And Pat was able to tell Bob all that's been going on in the more recent years in looking at the evidence, particularly in Hawaii. Bob returned to London, and it wasn't long before he came to see me and told me all about the Grinnells. And I must admit that my first reaction was based on my own prejudice, of course, and I remember saying it so very clearly, but they're forgeries, aren't they? Bob told me more about the issue, and I said, okay, let's keep an open mind. Let's make the Tackling collection copies available to this research purpose. After all, why do we have a national collection? What's it there for? That was a very easy decision to make indeed. So after some discussion, Pat came over to London with a number of the Grinnell stamps, and on the memorable day of the 3rd of July 2001, a little group comprising me, Pat, representing the owners, Dr. Tracy Chaplin and Dr. Greg Smith, both of the Department of Chemistry of University College London, and Dr. Jean Hall, who'd come over from New Jersey, gathered at the British Library. I think Bob Scully West was there as well. He was, yes, fine. Let me put a tick next to that query because this is going to get written up. Let's get that right. He'd shoot me. The first thing we did was repair to my office, and we looked at the stamps. I was determined that we should have a good visual inspection under natural daylight, and a little bit of me was still doubtful about them, I must admit. But as soon as Pat took them out, and as soon as I produced the sheet of those in the Tapling collection, it was immediately obvious to me that these were no ordinary forgeries if they were forgeries, and that if you mixed them up, you'd have trouble in telling them apart. On that basis, we then proceeded to the studio where the Raman machine exists. Now, the Raman machine, I'll explain in very simple terms because that's the only way I understand it, and we've got an expert sitting in the audience, is a piece of equipment that is making a great deal of difference to philatelic expertising. In very simple terms, the Raman machine is a device that points a laser beam at the stamp. Now, not laser beam as in James Bond movies, but laser beam that doesn't destroy anything. And one can point, using a microscope, the laser beam at the crystals in the ink. And by the reaction you get in reflected light that comes out on a screen in the form of, what's the proper word, Gene? Spectrum, that's it, thank you. I told you I was very non-technical. This has peaks, that's it. I was going to say bumps, peaks, thank you very much. I knew you'd be invaluable. And according to where those peaks are and the combinations of peaks, you can tell what that ink is made of. Now, we did this with the Grinnells, and we did this with the Tapling collection copies, and we found that the ink on both cases was made of the same substance, Prussian blue. The paper in both cases also contained paper brighteners, ultramarine blue. We also did some tests on some of the postmarks and found similar results. Now, this was particularly significant because it meant that the Grinnells were not made of something that was only invented or discovered or materialised after the period in question. If the Grinnells had been made of ink that could only have been made in 1880 or 1890, it would have instantly proved them to be forgeries. But it didn't. And we were all very excited by this possibility. Now, one has to be very careful about interpretation of these results, and that's why I've read out who was there, because it is not just a technical question, it is a question of technical and philatelic interpretation. At first we were particularly taken with the paper brighteners question, but subsequent work I've done using the Raman machinery has demonstrated that lots of 19th century papers have such paper brighteners, and recent tests with the Mauritius issue of 1858-62, the Britannia issues, show that they also have paper brighteners. So one needs to be careful about that. The tests from University College London were supervised by Professor Robin Clark, who's a member of the leading philatelic scientific organisation in Great Britain. He's a fellow of the Royal Society. And he joins us later in the day and certainly asked many testing questions as to our methodology earlier on. And of course Jean was there all the time checking on what we were doing too. Now, what's so very important about Jean being there and Robin being there was that it was possible to be sure that our methodology was the same. And Jean had done some pioneering work in November 2000, and the results that we got from the Grinnells was absolutely identical. So that was particularly significant. So in many ways we'd done the test twice. So this was an enormously important and exciting day in the history of the Grinnells. The discussions then, or in subsequent weeks, when everyone had gone home, had turned to the question of expertisation, because none of the Grinnells had actually been submitted to a recognised expert committee. And it was agreed after some debate that they should be submitted to an expert committee. The owners, and I've got owners on my notes here in bold type, felt that North American exportisers were prejudiced against the Grinnells and felt unable to submit the stamps to them. Most unfortunately, this has been backed up by discussions I've had with some of those people involved. I think that's a great shame. And this was also very much to my surprise. I think it's very unfortunate indeed if owners of philatelic material don't have confidence in exportising organisations. And I make that comment not to be destructive but for constructive purposes. Discussions then took place as to who should be exportising them, and once again underlined the owners made the decision to submit 55 copies to the expert committee of the Royal in London. Now you might say, why the Royal in London? Well, one of the reasons I think is because once again nobody has any vested interest. The Royal Expert Committee is neutral. There is no prejudice that I've ever detected there about these issues. As we've already established, the expert committee is independent, and it has also access to the Raman machinery and its own video spectral comparator, which looks at papers and inks under various types of light and conditions, and can record those data onto a computer. In addition to that, of course, it also has access to the 12 copies of the missionary stamps of the British Library, and just this week the extra copies, I think it's 10 copies here at the Smithsonian. So 22 copies have been used of the missionaries to compare with the Grinnells, so that's a fair proportion out of the 198 that exist. I'd also mention that the stamps were submitted with several volumes of supporting material, and all this took place in February or early March 2002. Now, when we were discussing how long this process would take, this was rather difficult, but I advised the owners that it would take anywhere between 6 months and 2 years to complete, and already we're getting near the 2 years, and, well, you don't hurry important things. Now, I'm going to show you just a few pieces here. This is just to give you some further whetting your appetite. This is a Grinnell item paying the 13 cents rate on the back of an envelope. An absolutely fabulous piece. I think this is the best piece in the collection. And here is one of the covers here at the Smithsonian. Beautiful item. I was looking at this yesterday and looking at the letter inside, which is dated. And here are the Smithsonian's four single copies of the 4 types that there are. Once again, if you look at the 2 cents and the 13 cents, they look different to the 5 and the 13 cents of the other type. And that's because the 2 cents and the 13 cents in fact are on backing paper. So one must be very carefully not being distracted by what's behind the stamp or adjacent to it, or in fact the colour of the postmark. And lastly, this wonderful cover, the only combination cover that's here, that's absolutely unique. Well, now I've mentioned evidence before, and the way that it cannot be dealt with in the same terms as a court of law. So let's have a look at some of this evidence. Now, I divided it into 2. There's of the stamps and of the background circumstances. Now, the first thing to say is that the Grinnells are not the same as the missionaries. They are typographically different. There is no doubt about that at all. Now, these are Grinnells, but one of the questions that this poses is why would any forger want to forge damaged stamps? The comparison of rare stamps historically has always been a very difficult issue. If your stamps are so rare that they're all around the world, and it's very rare for them to be in the same place at the same time, how do you expertise one when it comes along singly? Today, 4 copies of the Post Office Mauritius are thought to be lithographic forgeries, but no one's had them all together to do the research. Eventually it'll happen, and we'll compare the ones in London with those that might be submitted to the expert committee or in other places under controlled tests, and we'll find out. And it'll probably be the Raman and other machinery that will tell us the answer to those questions. So expertising has moved on from the magnifying days onto a more technical days, and this is going to resolve many of the outstanding questions. Now, the other point about the Grinnels is that none of them are repaired in any way, which is entirely consistent with an original find, all of them being forgeries, of course. Whenever you see one piece of evidence in this, you always find a conflicting piece that takes you back into neutral territory. Now, the 2 copies on the outside are from the Taplin collection, and the 2 cents, if you look very carefully, at the top and the bottom frame lines is completely added in. You'll see it's in a slightly different blue colour. And if you look at the 5 cents on the right, the top right hand, where the red is entirely added on. It's entirely fake. So many of these stamps seem to have been ripped off covers, or someone was trying to remove them from covers, and the stamps are incredibly thin and on fragile paper. And many of them are repaired. I think that Carl Hahn, in his excellent paper, which is in the booklet, says that 60% of them have been repaired, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But none of the Grinnels have, but that's consistent with them being find or forgeries. Now, no examination has been made of the 198 missionary stamps, nor of the Grinnels. And nobody knows whether there are Grinnels amongst the 198 missionary stamps. Now, you were confused today by what I've shown you. I mean, that was unfair, it was deliberate, but it proves a point. So I think one of the things that those interested in this subject need to do is to have, and it'll take many years to do, is to have high quality digital photographs made of both Grinnels and of missionaries, so that accurate one-to-one comparisons of typefaces can be made, and to prove that they're either one group or the other, or a forgery of a different description. And we've already had an example of that today. Now, this will take, I don't know, 50 years to do. Owners are reluctant to part up with their stamps. Stamps are locked away in bank vaults. So before the real truth comes out could be a long way into the future. But I think that's a study that someone ought to agree to do, once again, to arrive at the most important thing, which is the truth. Now, there's one very important difference apart from typographically, although it is typographical, is that the types of the stamps, each stamp comes in 2 types. In one type, the P of postage is flush with the edge, and another type, it's indented. Now, this is the page from the Taplin collection that was written up by the first curator there, Sir Edward Bacon, early in the 1890s. And at that time, nobody knew the arrangement of the 2 types because they come in pairs, one type next to another. So, only having singles, he arbitrarily called one type type 1 and one type type 2. But a little later on, oh, there's the Taplin collection copies taken off the page. A little later on, we'll come back to that one, this cover was discovered and written about in 1904. Now, this is the only example of a horizontal pair of the missionaries, and is the proving piece that the arrangement of the two types was the reverse of what Sir Edward Bacon had originally thought. But the Tapling page that we saw earlier is still written up in the old form. Now, the Grinnels are in the earlier version of these two types. So one asks the question, why? If they are forgeries, then they may well have been made sometime between 1890 and 1904. But that's if they're forgeries. Who knows? Now, this gentleman, Brewster Kenyon, has been, by some people, credited as being the forger of the Grinnels, if indeed that's the case. That's the hypothesis. And he published a book in 1895, and I've got some photocopies here, in which he said of the first issue, typeface stamps printed on very thin bluish wove paper, in horizontal strips of various lengths. But how could he say that in 1895 if the first pair wasn't discovered until 1904? And that's some of the principal evidence for the stamps being forgeries or of some other known status, who knows. But it is a difficulty and complication in the argument, and one that's typical of the story throughout. You'll notice I'm very carefully not giving you answers to these questions. And here we have a horizontal pair of the Grinnels, where you can see the arrangement of the P under the H, and you see they're reversed. I now want to turn to the question of postmarks, because the Grinnels that have circular red postmarks on only have, there's a distinctive type that only appears on the Grinnels, and it's the one on the right on the screen. It only appears there. So you have a distinctively different stamp with a distinctively different postmark, and that, of course, in very simple terms, although there's other evidence, does tend to be against the stamps. These are not particularly wonderful illustrations, but nonetheless it proves the point that they're very different if you look at the word paid, for example. Now, turning to the question of the backgrounds. If you accept the original story of the meeting in 1918 of George Grinnell and Charles Shattuck and Grinnell's acquisition of the 71 stamps, a lot of the subsequent story must be taken at face value, and a great deal of very splendid work has been done in proving the circumstances and the facts, and that work is the subject of some of the volumes that's been submitted to the Royal. No doubt that will be publicly available in due course. Now, there is the man himself, taken a few years later, I think. And here is Charles Shattuck at that famous meeting in 1918. 1918, of course, was a wonderful year for philately, because there were two major finds. There was the Grinnell find, and there was the sheet of the inverted jenny that some very lucky philatelist bought him and bought the complete lot. Amazing. Philatelist's dream. Now, George Grinnell was a school teacher and a man who was very much into culture. That's the house where the two met, by the way. But he wasn't used to dealing with business transactions involving tens of dollars, and when these stamps came along, I think this probably showed to some extent, because he originally offered a certain number of copies for $100,000 and eventually sold a greater number of copies for only $65,000. So he was working on his own. He probably didn't use anyone else. And in the court case that took place subsequently, he was probably very poorly advised, and he didn't, for example, bring on any expert witnesses to counteract other expert witnesses that were brought in. In fact, some of the evidence at the trial was contradictory, because one particular person, one of the witnesses, said that the stamps were produced photographically, and another witness went on to say that there were differences between the two types. Well, there's a contradiction, and why the judge never picked up on that fairly fundamental point, no one will ever know. But if that had been thought about, then the result may well have been different, who knows. There's a number of other outstanding questions that come along, and I think the next slide is interesting because it shows part of the transcript of the trial where the acquisition of the stamps by George Grinnel was described, and a sum of $5 was put on the table. Charles Shattuck didn't seem to want any money for these. He didn't think they were of any significance whatever. But $5 certainly passed hands, and there's part of the trial transcript which exists in part still today. It's a document which is about this thick. Now, one or two issues remain today, like why did George Grinnel tell John Kleeman that 43 stamps existed, and in fact 71 did? We don't know the answer to that. Why did Kleeman sue Grinnell? Why didn't Kleeman just go back and say, we don't think they're any good, can we have our money back please? How did it get to a court case that went on for some time? These are interesting questions that we'll probably never know the answer to now, or if someone does know, then they ought to be writing it up and telling us. $65,000, of course, was a lot of money. Why didn't they just have it back in exchange and avoid a court case that was very painful for everyone? But I have to look at the court case and say, well, how independent were some of the witnesses there? The person that was actually buying a great deal of the stamps was the wealthy collector Caspari. Now, he had one of the most important collections in the world at the time, and of all time, and he brought in witnesses that were dealers. That's fine, but how neutral were they? How independent were they? Were they involved in selling stamps to Caspari? They certainly came up with some interesting evidence, and I've already alluded to two elements of it that are contradictory. So one must ask several questions over that. Why did the Secret Service become involved? Who told them about this? Because these are not United States fiscal objects which would interest them. They're the Kingdom of Hawaii before Hawaii became part of the United States. These are a pair of the 5 cents that were taken in by the Secret Service, and they were marked on the reverse, and you can see where the arrow is. The Secret Serviceman clearly wasn't a philatelist, was he? And he put those marks on, and there's a number of those that exist in that sort of thing. We certainly know they're genuine Grinnells. In this whole issue, I've been struck by the strength of feeling in this matter. I've never witnessed such passion in any philatelic subject before, nor have I seen people with such firm opinions expressed without seeing the evidence, without ever seeing any of the stamps. You can go some way in expressing opinions, but you don't actually see the real thing. How do you know it's ever going to work? How do you know what you're looking at? Some little while ago, Vince and Carol Arrigo, owners of some of the stamps, produced an article, the Grinnel Missionaries stamps, addressing the critics, the results of scientific research and discoveries in provenance. And this was published in the Chronicle in 2002. Even in London, I detected there was an outcry by those people who had closed minds. There was a call for peer review. Why wasn't this peer reviewed? And the people concerned seem to have missed the point that in long-running research questions, it's perfectly in order to have one article that takes one view only, and then a reverse view elsewhere. And in this particular case, an article written by one of the interested parties absolutely without any change or editing was very important evidence indeed to record in the periodicals for research. I got the impression, in fact, that those people asking for peer review that might have changed the article dramatically and defeated the whole purpose were not looking for peer review at all, but censorship. And this is based on small-mindedness and prejudice. And I hope that lots of people are going to learn some lessons by that point. I make it only to be constructive. And there have been times also when I felt that some people have understood that the stamps are on trial, not anyone else. Now, in bringing this to a conclusion, let's go on to another slide. There we are. I must tell you how the expert committee are going to report this in due course. They're going to put a research article onto the website of the Royal Philatelic Society London, which will be heralded by an email to the interested parties and to the press, so that the results of the deliberations, whatever that is, are immediately available. The article may not be illustrated there, but certainly it will then appear for permanent record in the Royal's Journal, the London Philatelist. Now, the expert committee are still looking at evidence, and if there are any owners of any of these stamps that would like to make them available to the expert committee, we've seen 22, or they've seen 22 so far, would you speak to Patrick Pearson or to Wilson, and he will make the contacts. And also a paper based on this lecture will appear in the Collectors Club Philatelist sometime in the new year. And I'd just like to close, before we get to questions, I'm not off the hook yet, by thanking those people who've helped me with this presentation and with information: Ginny Horn, Bob Scully West, Dr. Jean Hall, Professor Robin Clark in London, and Wilson, of course, Alan and his staff, who've been absolutely super in setting up this memorable occasion for me. If you have any questions, I'll attempt to avoid them, answer them. Who has the first impossible question? You should come up to the microphones in the centre of the room.
Could you comment on how the Grinnells and the Missionaries are typographically different?
The question was, could I comment on how they're typographically different? How long have you got? We could be here for all night if I attempted to answer that question. I suspect it's not going to be suitable for today. All I can really say is that they are, and it's entirely consistent, of course, and this is the evidence for the stamps, in the fact that they're made from movable type. So it comes really in two forms. The type moves because movable type moves. It could be, for example, that various printings have been made. We don't know that. And that's why the study of all of the examples are going to be crucial for actually finally establishing that. Because nobody knows in which order those stamps were printed. We know the last one came out in 1852, but when they started printing the others, did they start with the 2, or did they start with the 5, or did they start with the 13? And if they kept the type standing and they moved the different parts around, it was going to move. So the ornamentation is part of the detail, but if you look across lots of originals and lots of Grinnells, you will see that they all vary in the quality of printing and typeface to some extent. So the final answer to that question is, when the study's been done, then we'll really be able to know a lot more about them.
If I understood you correctly, you said the postmarks between Grinnells and Missionaries were different. If that's the case, then how is that? How can one reconcile that? Is there any clue in the dates that could explain the difference?
Well, there's 3 types of cancellations on the stamps. There's manuscripts, there's black grids, and there's the circular red that we got to a little earlier. Let's see if we can go back. There we are. Now, the postmark on the right only exists on the Grinnells. Now, the significance of that to an expertiser is to say, well, there's a forgery on a forgery. But there may be other evidence that proves otherwise, and some has been written. And the important thing about having this here today is that you should go away and read the point that's been made there. Otherwise, I know this subject will be here all night, but that is essentially it. Those are the facts. The interpretation, of course, is a much more complicated issue. Michael.
Yes, David. You and that team have placed a lot in the Tapling collection copies as a sort of baseline for a lot of your studies, yet the Tapling collection has the, quote, reputation, unquote, of containing many forgeries in, I can't speak for the missionaries, I have no idea, but certainly in some of the Latin American countries with which I'm much more familiar with their philately, there are a number of extremely suspicious pieces there. Could you comment on how you can be sure that Grinnells or Missionaries, the copies in the Tapling collection, are the real McCoy?
Thank you.
We've known one another for at least 20 years, and I'm sure he's suspected.
You can always tease your friends, that only proves it. Well, thank you for asking a very good question. I'll tease you back now. We don't, of course. It's the same principle as all the rest of it. Before the real studies have been done across all of the stamps, we don't actually finally know. But what we do know, and you're right about certain forgeries in the collection, although it's not that peppered with forgeries, there's two points. Firstly, we know that the collection has actually been in existence and together from a particular time. In a previous, let's see if we can find the page. Coming up next. In a previous write-up in Thomas Tapling's time, he in fact exhibited this page, and we have a photograph of it, in the 1890 philatelic exhibition in London. And it was Sir Edward Bacon, the first curator, that wrote this up a little later in his handwriting, in 1893, I expect. The beauty about collections which have remained intact is the very reverse of the point you've made, and that is, of course, that if you've had a copy, if you had a collection that's been there since 1891, you know you haven't got the 1905 forgery, so the argument works both ways. All I can say is that 2 weeks ago we celebrated the centenary of the Tapling collection being on exhibition at the British Library and the British Museum before, and no one has ever come along and said any of them are forgeries. That's not a complete answer, but I suspect it's like all of the copies and we could say about any of the copies for that matter, until someone's actually undertaken all the research, how do we actually know? So really, it comes back to the point about stamps that are very, very rare. What are the opportunities for comparing them? And it's why I've made why Patrick Pearson's come across from London to look at the copies here at the Smithsonian, and also is appealing for anyone else that has copies to make them available to the expertising exercise. So I think we'd quite like, or they'd quite like, to see 50 copies, a quarter of the missionaries. That would be good if it could be done. But some group or other really ought to start that research project. Sir.
I hate to admit that I was a little late, so you may have discussed this already. Are there any plans to chemically analyze the inks and the paper on a known original as compared to the Grinnells?
That has been done using the Raman technology, and the answer was that the inks and the postmark inks and the paper brighteners are all made of the same substance. And what that demonstrates is that none of the inks on the Grinnells were made at a later date, so they're contemporary materials. It doesn't make them genuine necessarily, but it means that one couldn't reject them instantly if they were the materials they were made of was made much, much later. Fred, here comes the real question.
I deeply appreciate your remarks. Thank you for tricking me.
It was a pleasure.
You didn't have a category, neither of the above.
That was your trap. But in Flatterly, you have to watch out for the traps everywhere.
And I'll learn to be careful of you. Given that the type is not like any genuine stamp, and given that there were 6 presses in Hawaii at the time, and Honolulu was a relatively small town, and these presses all produced product that can be compared, what has been done to identify which press and whether there was any typeface of that kind that's seen on the Grinnell in Hawaii in 1851?
Well, that's a question for the expert committee. No, I'm not going to duck that. It is their question. I know, Fred, that you've issued a challenge for someone to come up with the same typefaces on the Grinnells. Possibly one of the problems is that the Grinnells have not been widely illustrated. That's a factor. I'm not quite sure what you can do at this late date to take that further forward. Perhaps you've got an answer for us.
I've looked.
And you found no evidence?
I have found nothing.
That's part of the evidence. The lady.
Prussian blue ink was made by deception.
Sorry, can't hear you. Can you come up to the microphone?
According to what I've read on the internet, Prussian blue ink was made by deception. Is there any harking back to that original deception to determine who might have done that?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. You mean, if they're forgeries, who was the forger?
Well, the man who made Prussian blue went to the dye maker to make a red ink.
Yes.
And the dye maker deceived him, and he was a soap maker actually,
right.
And he made a blue ink, which was Prussian blue, instead. So someone may have been doing the call and response in that regard.
Right.
To hark back to that original deception.
Well, that's possible, but we know when the stamps were found in 1918. The tests that we've done recently were not available at that time. So I don't think that would apply at all, because the modern tests will tell you exactly what they're made of. Bob.
As I understand it, all the ones that are accepted as missionaries share the same type and the same appearance of the Honolulu CDS. And all of the Grinnells are a different type and a different Honolulu CDS where it has that CDS.
That's right.
It is an interesting point that should be pursued, I'm sure, to try to explain satisfactorily why you don't have cross-fertilization between the two large bodies of stamps, why all of those in the Grinnell find should be sequestered, so to speak, and not found, and not a one of the ones with those characteristics should make it into the body of what are known as the missionaries.
You've hit the nail on the head, and I would say that was possibly one of the key pieces of evidence or arguments in this question. How do you explain it? One of them is that they're forgeries. Another is, well, perhaps it's there, I don't know. I know that Vince and Carol have written on that. I can't remember exactly what their argument to that was. But I can't know everything today, but certainly all those arguments and the point that they've made about this has been submitted to the expert committee, so this is being taken into account. There is an answer to that from the owners of the stamps. Sir. Charlie, what's your question?
Well, it's not a question, it's just a follow-up on the last item. It was the question of the provenance, it was the question of the son working in the type shop, taking off to the other island, the possibility that he served as a postmaster there, and that argument and that provenance, that history is in the brochure, and I would invite people to read it there, but I didn't feel that they should go home feeling there was no answer.
No, indeed, and I would thank you for that. I think the answer is that one can only, as I said at the beginning, cover certain aspects of this, and that this gives you more information, more background, because if we get into detail, we'll be here for a week, I can tell you. I mean, I've been involved in these discussions, and it's very, very difficult to discuss questions of detail of typography here without drawing facilities and everyone being fully on the ball and understanding what's going on. So it's not really possible to discuss in this forum those sorts of issues, but it's written down in this book. That's why it's been structured in this sort of way. Any more questions? Yes, two more coming up.
Not so much a question as a point of information. There's a wonderful exhibit just a few blocks away from here at the Folger Shakespeare Library on fakes, forgeries, and facsimiles in another realm that might be of interest.
Something else to do in town? Thank you for that.
Excuse me. You mentioned just today that you'd be seeking collectors who own, quote, quote, missionaries,
indeed, indeed.
To submit them to you. Has that request been publicized prior to now, and is today or this week the first time you've had access to the Smithsonian stamps as well? And I'm wondering if you intend to publicize the call for missionaries in the Philatelist Press, or if that's already been done.
Patrick Pearson, as chairman of the expert committee, has examined the missionaries here for the first time this week, yesterday in fact, and the call has been made by me firstly today. We'll have to think about how we might do that further afield. If any, has anyone here actually owned any missionaries? One. Where is it?
At home.
Why didn't you bring it?
You didn't tell me.
Well, this came up from a conversation actually earlier in the week where clearly the importance of seeing the maximum number of copies was going to be very, very useful indeed. But yeah, we'll have to think about, or the experts will have to think. I'm not involved, but I'm sure Patrick is keenly listening at the back there, and we'll have to consider how that might be done.
Very well. Good luck to you. It does seem like it ought to be publicized more widely. It does seem like a great idea because perhaps you'll find more typographical twins to the Grinnells.
Or more Grinnells.
That are absent.
Or more just forgeries, who knows?
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, one more question. Gentleman in the green shirt has it.
You referenced the existence of prejudice on the part of North American expertising services, and I was wondering if you would have any views on whether that's a systemic problem or whether it's particular to this question of the Grinnells, and if you have any recommendations as to how the expertising services can be improved or what organized philately in North America can do to avoid prejudice in the expertisers.
Well, that's a very good question. I've only detected any prejudice in any expertising that's a general prejudice on this particular issue. One can detect prejudice where someone is the owner of the stamps, of course, or someone has a vested interest, perhaps an auctioneer or a dealer or whatever. I think that the best way of dealing with independence is to set up organisations independently. And I don't make the remark against anyone in particular, but dealer involvement can be a good and a bad thing. And it's often difficult to know where the vested interest lies. It's also very difficult for anyone in any business expertising for colleagues. There must be problems involved in that. The Royal, of course, is entirely composed of amateurs, so it's a relatively straightforward thing for us. And it's very easy also to say it. Prejudice, how can you expel prejudice in anything? All you can do is your best. I think the thing to do is approach any question with an open mind, but that's each individual to understand that that's how you approach expertising questions. If you've had a history or you've been exposed to something, you have an entrenched view, to change that view takes a lot to move it. And I think that's one of the reasons why the two owning families came to the Royal in London, away from possible prejudice perhaps, well there is prejudice, and away from those who've been involved to get a fresh look. But it's a very difficult thing. It's the same in anything where you're judging anything. How do you get it perfect? There's no such thing as a perfect world. Thank you very much.